Welcome to the WebAfriqa Podcast. The format is simple. I'm a millennial, born in Africa, but raised in America and Canada. My co-host is Professor Tierno S. Ba, a Fulbright scholar, a researcher, and a web publisher who has extensive knowledge about African history, politics, and culture. In this series, called Between the Hammer and the Anvil, we discuss the reasons why Africa is still lagging behind the rest of the world. In episode 1, I introduce Professor Ba, and we discuss how capitalism and the Industrial Revolution in Europe led to the transatlantic slave trade and the scramble for Africa. To support the podcast and the WebAfriqa portal, make sure to donate to Professor Ba's Patreon. The link will be found in the description. We have Professor Tierno S. Ba on the other line. What we'll do is we'll just basically start with your introduction of who you are, what your history is, what your professional specialization is in history, or just overall in general. Just telling everybody who you are.
The name is Tierno Ba. I am a former professor at the University of Conakry, where I taught linguistics and African languages from 1975 to 1982. That year, in 82, I won a Fulbright scholarship and came to the United States as a senior Fulbright scholar at the University of Texas at Austin. The purpose of my trip was to do research on the verbal art and aesthetic speech of the Fulbe or Fouta Djallon. There are three categories of speech makers in the Fouta Djallon. These are the learned and erudite intelligentsia, called Tchernobe or Serembe. There are the griot, called Aulube, and then the troubadours, or popular artists, called Nyamakala. And I focused on those three. That's how I won the scholarship, which was a competitive endeavor between 5 professors. And ever since I've been, before coming to the US, I had been also wearing several hats in Guinea. Not only was I teaching, but I was the co-publisher of the scholarly journal called Media, in Maninka language means thought.
Is there, sorry to interrupt, is there a reason why you selected that name specifically?
It was a Maninka name. As you recall, the first regime was predominantly Maninka, but we didn't object to the word. We were all cultural nationalists, and we valuing each other's language. So Maninka was, the name was a Maninka name. It means thinking or thought in that language.
And this is Sekou Touré's time.
Right, between 1975 again in 1982. It was at the peak of his regime, actually.
And you said a word, something nationalist. You were pan-nationalist or pro-nationalist? What was the term you used?
Well, basically, it's the fact that colonization inflicted upon all African societies alienation and acculturation, making us think that we were all primitives and without culture or knowledge or civilization. So every step was taken, steps taken at that time were to counter that ideology, which lasted 60 years and which is still actually in place in many minds. That's why I'm using the term cultural nationalist, to avoid the political aspect one. We were trying to value or enhance or disseminate our languages, our cultures from our vantage point, which is different, i.e. from different disciplines of the social sciences, sociology. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay, so I didn't press the red button.
Okay.
So that was it. It was just something that has to be done. It was done partly, and it still need to be done. Most societies in Africa don't really focus on one key aspect of development, i.e., literacy in the local languages. So the choice of the word stemmed from the fact that we all agreed, whether Sekou or not, that African languages needed to be, or still need to be, used as language of communication in most areas of administration, of social life, not simply for symbolic purposes or sacred purposes.
Okay, so that was media, is what you called it, correct?
Right.
Okay, so you were talking about that.
Yeah, media was published from 1975 to 1982, the year I left. And it won some recognition, first of all, inside the country. Sekou himself was somewhat proud of it. And from Morocco, Algeria received letters, acknowledging the publication and thanking us for somewhat contributing something intellectually out of Guinea, because it was such a secluded place, so cut out from the rest of the world.
And why do you think that was?
The regime was very much hostile to foreign presence, and it was very hard because Sekou had this autocratic conception of power, dictatorial actually, and he didn't want scholars, intellectuals who are free minds to come to Guinea and start poking around or asking questions or writing things that he did not approve of.
And to what extent was that influenced by Soviet or, kind of Far Eastern philosophies about leadership? Or was that homegrown?
It's the same mode of thinking of rulers who think that they are the masters of the country, not the servants of its populations. It stems from the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, which was created in 1946 in Bamako, Mali, and which was heavily influenced by the French Communist Party, which was at that time the premier political party in France. After the Second World War, they had contributed so much to defeating Hitler and Nazism that they became popular and were the first political party ahead of any other right-wing or centrist party in France. So they were members of the government, and when the time came and when Africans told France and England, listen, we shed blood to free you from Hitler, now we want our freedom. Loosen the chains of bondage, of colonial bondage, set us free. We want to be free. That triggered the process of creating political parties in Africa, which were prohibited in French West Africa or French Equatorial Africa. It was legally prohibited to create a political party if you were a black person in Africa, in your own homeland. But the Second World War changed everything. The elite African people saw that Europe was not so powerful as it claimed to be. So they started asking for autonomy first and then independence. That's when the communists stepped in with they were eager to help, quote unquote, but it was self-serving kind of help or assistance. And in the process, they molded somehow the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, which was spearheaded by Félix Houphouët-Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire. And that movement retained two things from the model that the communists proposed. One of them was the somewhat hierarchical top-down approach to politics. What the elite decides is what goes.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other was the intolerance toward intellectuals,
Mm-hmm.
scholars.
Mm-hmm.
If you recall, in Cote d'Ivoire,
Mm-hmm.
Amadou Kourouma, who died, I think, in 2006, or I don't recall, I'll check later,
Mm-hmm.
was one of the main writers of the 20th century. But he was very critical of Houphouët-Boigny, of all the post-colonial elite.
And what was he critical of?
Of everything. He wrote two books that are really classic books about post-colonial Africa. The first one was The Sons of Independence, Sun, S-U-N-S, meaning the searing heat of independence.
Mm-hmm.
The second was When the Wild Beasts Vote. And in both of them, it was very satirical, first of all, and very sharp in his writing.
Mm-hmm.
He blended the syntax of France with proverbs from African languages, particularly his native Maninka language.
Mm-hmm.
And he spent 10 years submitting his the first draft, the first manuscript of the Sons of Independence.
Mm-hmm.
The French publishers would not publish it, so he went to Canada. That's where he was published first and became a bestseller.
Mm.
Now it is a classic in African literature.
Mm-hmm.
So, but a mind like him had to flee Cote d'Ivoire and become a refugee in France, where he died.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a case in point in terms of intolerance, of dictatorship,
and that's
mind-controlling approach to the exercise of political power in Africa.
And it's interesting regarding these writers because many of them were expatriates and ended up in France, writing there, like Kamara Lai for especially for Guinea, who went out there and wrote. So you're saying that around this time, so this is 1982, when the environment was very anti-intellectual and it was sort of a stifling environment. You decided that America was going to be the land of milk and honey for you. Was that the case?
Well, remember, it was a competitive scholarship offered by the federal government of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So after years of interruptions, the Fulbright scholarship or system has been running since the end of the Second World War.
Yeah.
It's very prestigious, and that year, the United States offered one scholarship to Guinea.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And to China, they would offer 200 or 5,000, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a competitive one. It was not like plucking someone and saying, well, you get the scholarship. So we had to go through two tests. First of all, English language proficiency, and the substantive nature of your research proposal.
And at that point, you were proficient in English?
Yeah, I was somewhat proficient in writing, but I was still polishing my English, but I had been heavily investing into the English language.
How did you do that?
Very early on, when Guinea became independent in 1958, it created a union with Ghana. It was Ghana-Guinea Union.
Mm.
And Ghana sent to Guinea English teachers, and I was in my 5th grade when I had my first English teacher. I liked what I learned, and I never, looked back. I kept learning. I even nicknamed myself Ray Charles from the famous musician's name to make sure that I was sticking with the English language.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how I came to America. It was very competitive, but it was it turned somewhat both bad and good.
Okay.
Because the government would not allow me to stay more than a year.
Mm-hmm.
The federal authorities, looking at my performance during my first 6 months, asked me to come to Washington, where I'm now. I was in Texas, and they said, Mr. Bao, we like what you have been doing, and you have been a good representative for Guinea. So we are offering you the scholarship for the PhD. And all you have to do is to call on your government and let them know through the embassy. They can just give their green light verbally. We will do the paperwork later, so that when your scholarship ends, you will automatically be entered into the PhD program and funded by the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
So I sent the message back to Guinea. They said, no, you have to come back first, and then you'll go back again. I said, why? And in the past, a lot of people had fallen into that trap.
Mm.
They are called back to Guinea because they had an opportunity, and then when they arrived, they're arrested at the airport and sent to Camp Boiro.
And can you expound a little bit?
I knew Camp Boiro was the political prison that called also the tropical gulag, nicknamed after the Soviet system of killing prisoners into remote concentration camps. But in Guinea, the camp is in the heart of Conakry, across the street from the main hospital of Conakry. It was a military barrack of the Republican Guard. It is still. Mm-hmm. But within it, they built a political prison that, according to Amnesty International, killed more than 50,000 people.
Wow.
Among them, the brightest and the most the most enterprising people and the most dedicated nationalists among the political leaders. And that's why I created the Camp Boiro, which is a specific site devoted to documenting and denouncing the endemic human rights violations that have been going on in Guinea since 1959 to today.
And one of the ironic things that I've heard was that the individual who actually created Camp Boiro ended up dying in Camp Boiro, was sent there.
Right, and that's Keita Fodeba of the famous Ballets Africains, which was the main, maybe, artistic group in West Africa, at least, for at least a decade or two.
So he was responsible for creating the camp itself.
Right, he was a teacher and a griot, Maninka griot, or troubadour from his mother's side. And he just quit teaching and created his group. And they first started performing in Dakar. Then they moved to France, to Paris, where he received funding. And the group became very famous and rightfully so, very brilliant. But Sekou Touré was a buddy of his. So when he ascended to power first as mayor of Conakry in 1956, then as vice president of the autonomous government of Guinea in 1957, he asked Fodeba to come back home, to go back home and help him manage the government. First of all, Fodeba was reluctant, but under pressure and due to friendship, he agreed.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
Just on this thought line here, Fodeba was a teacher. Then
he was a teacher,
and then he created this dancing troupe, right?
The Ballets Africains.
The Ballets Africains.
It's still alive. It's still running.
And you mentioned the notion of friendship, and
he was a friend of Sekou Touré.
And the elements of patronage, and something that is very common throughout all autocratic regimes all over the world, if not Africa specifically, of putting people who may not be the most efficient or capable in positions of power because these people are your friends and are thus loyal to you. Is that a fair assessment of the situation, that he brought him in there because he was loyal to him, or do you think to some extent he was capable of helping run the government?
It's the latter.
Yeah.
He was a very capable, strongly detail-oriented person, and who has again been successful in building up the premier ballet or dancing group from all the 8 colonies that the French had in West Africa. It was second to none. So he was known for his organizational skills.
But I mean, arts and government and governance are not diametrically opposite, but they are somewhat different in terms of what you need in order to implement policies and public policies, right?
Right, but you can transfer the skills acquired in one field to the other.
Okay.
If you think of Ronald Reagan, most of his qualities as statesman were learned at Hollywood. Speaking, demeanor, and all that. This is something he earned or he learned from acting.
But then he became a governor
first
before when he went for the presidency. Fodeba, what was his transition from?
Fodeba had no transition. He was actually parachuted by Sékou Touré, and you are right to dwell on that point, because later on the traditional leaders of the ruling party of Guinea, called Parti Démocratique de Guinée,
PDG,
would come to resent Sékou Touré's choice and full empowerment of someone, quote unquote, imported from France, who had not been engaged in the local struggle. That will lead to serious tensions and dissensions within the party, at least the rulership, and it will cost Fodeba his life. And that's why when you mentioned the founder, the creator, or the builder of the Camp Boiro, who was Keita Fodeba, ultimately died there in 1969 after he was arrested for plotting against Sékou Touré.
And was Sékou Touré obviously aware of this?
It was a claim that they never substantiated. There was no proof of it, like all the other plots. You are guilty the minute you are accused. You are tried in your absence. You have no right to counsel. You cannot defend yourself or confront your accuser. You are doomed. The minute you are indexed as an enemy of the regime, unless Sékou Touré has mercy on you, then you are doomed. And that's what happened to Fodeba, because he was not. Sékou Touré had no mercy, even though they had long-standing friendship. He had him executed by firing squad in 1969.
Wow.
Like so many others who were very close to him, Sékou Touré, in his early days and throughout the struggle for autonomy and independence, he turned against those people and had them killed one by one.
And was this, it's that French statement, I forget who said it, but, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Do you believe it is the fundamental position as a leader? I kind of know the answer to this, but I want to know a little bit a wider perspective. But do you think it's fundamental to the position where you are corrupted to do things of this nature because of whatever, no limitations, no checks and balances, no separation of powers? Or do you think Sékou Touré, I don't know, I guess we're psychoanalyzing him here, but he had the personality to impose this type of regime?
But remember, it was a gradual process. It was not like, from the get-go, he obtained all the power he so wanted. It was a gradual process.
Because he had to rise in the PDG, right?
Because within the party, he was opposed all the way through. At the top, he has a nemesis who was both a nemesis and a loyal colleague and his name was Saifullah Jallow.
Saifullah, yeah.
Saifullah preceded Secretary into politics. Secretary's public life began in the unions, trade unions. He was a trade unionist for the first 4 or 5 years of his public activity. He joined politics later, but Saifullah was all the way politician from the first day. And he was considered more intellectual, more poised to make decisions and stick with them, and a better organizer. He is a good writer. He wrote all the text documents, drafted most of them, and but he was not loquacious, he was not eloquent, he was not a narrator. In a context like Guinea, where illiteracy is predominant,
and still is,
the power of the oral language, of the verbal language, is it cannot be matched by writing. Because if you write, no one can read you. But if you speak well, you have a microphone, a radio station, then you are bound to gain, popularity or power.
And that was Sekou Touré's comparative advantage.
That was his comparative advantage, and many other things also. He used all the tricks of the trade to really ascend, because from 1947, when the PDG was created, to 1951, Saifullah was the first leader of the PDG. It was a collective leadership. They chose one Pulo or Pulani, one Maninka, and one Soso, who are the people of Conakry, to create a troika, a trio, so that the party could be representative of the major ethnic groups of the country. So Saifullah represented the Fouta Djallon or the Fulbe. Madera Keita, who was a Bamana or Bambara from Mali, represented the Mande people. And Suma represented the Soso Baga of Conakry.
So this was part of the cultural nationalism that was initially embedded at the beginning.
Yeah, and it was a compromise, because it was really the first time again that the French allowed Africans to create political parties, and they had to. Their building blocks were all ethnics. They had no other way to start than their own ethnic group. But it didn't mean that they were not aware of the need to coalesce, to bring people together, and to create a higher unit called the nation. From the constituent, from its basic constituency, or what that are the ethnic groups.
So this is within the PDG.
So Saifullah was there all the time, and he almost killed him in 1976-77 when he executed Teli Diallo, the first Secretary General of the African Organization of African Unity, now called the African Union, who died of starvation and thirst at Kambwaro in 1977, along with 5 of his co-accused.
And that's what you call the...
Aliou Ndramé.
You were saying Aliou Ndramé?
Aliou Ndramé and Afomar Bari, Alassane Diallo, Lamine Kouyaté were all executed of starvation at Kambwaro in 76-77.
And that's the Black Diet.
But, yeah, the Black Diet. But again, Secretary was not necessarily the best in terms of leadership, and he did face challenge within the party, but he managed to overcome it and to react negatively by killing his former opponents or those who disapproved of him in the past. So, he kept notes, he wrote down names, and he scheduled purges and eliminations and killings that wiped out all his either real dissidents
or imagined
or rivals within the party.
Wow. It just keeps just this kind of corollary to just Russia. And the Soviet form
it's
is
Stalinian. It's a very Stalin type of regime. It spared no one who was perceived as an adversary.
Mm-hmm.
But the comparison with Russia is almost just elementary,
Mm-hmm.
because Russia managed to build an industrial society.
Mm-hmm.
They wiped out illiteracy.
Mm-hmm.
In all languages, not simply in Russian, but in the republics, the different Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, and others.
Mm-hmm.
So they were more somewhat nationalistic and more, they adhered to their program. They executed the program. Guinea was all centered around one individual, one person, the personality cult of secretary.
So are you saying that the methods that were implemented in Russia themselves were successful, or I'm just trying to understand that aspect of things? Because some people would contest and say, there was some cult of personality in Russia with Stalinism, as you were saying, and that hundreds of millions of people died specifically during the Second World War. There were purges, as you said. There was the gulags, the kulaks as well as famine because of lack of food. Do you think that? Are you saying that they implemented their main party objectives as opposed to what Guinean form of, I guess, whatever you want to call it, neo-Marxism or not Marxism in general, was unable to? Or could you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, Guinea was an underdeveloped colony of France.
Mm.
It is still today an underdeveloped country.
Mm-hmm.
It has not moved forward, it has moved backward.
Mm-hmm.
Russia has collapsed in terms of the Soviet Union has collapsed, but
mm-hmm.
it has an industrial base. It makes planes, it
mm-hmm.
makes refrigerator,
mm-hmm.
cars. It has electricity.
So you're saying the economic foundation itself was executed far better, pardon the pun, far better
Right. In the midst of repression,
mm-hmm.
Stalin managed to build an economic,
mm-hmm.
an industrial base that is still
mm-hmm.
in place today, or has been more or less modernized.
Okay.
And remember also, they were able, thanks to their ingenuity,
mm-hmm.
energy, and creativity, to resist and defeat Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
If they had been a weak kind of economy without an industrial base capable of building tanks,
mm-hmm.
airplanes, trains, and what have you,
mm-hmm.
all the wherewithal needed to wage a war,
mm-hmm.
then Hitler would have ruled Russia. But
okay.
they reacted first to the invasion in the Barbarossa operation launched by Hitler against Russia, and then they managed to defeat him almost single-handedly, because they were not necessarily helped by the West.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the fundamental difference. And let's not even dwell on the war side. It's
mm-hmm.
the cultural. They were really nationalistic in Russia,
mm-hmm.
both at the pan-Russian level, which predated Stalin and Lenin.
Mm-hmm.
Under the Tsar, there was a strong awareness of Russian civilization with
mm-hmm.
Dostoevsky's and what's his name, Pushkin, the
mm-hmm.
major poet of Russia, who
mm-hmm.
is from African descent.
Mm-hmm.
And Russia has always been aware of its culture and managed to build a powerful literature
mm-hmm.
and cinema industry,
Of course. Yeah.
Eisenstein with Potemkin
mm-hmm.
and his followers all created local cinema industry.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no comparison really between Guinea and the former Soviet Union, except for the fact that the leadership of Guinea
mm-hmm.
imitated or picked up
mm-hmm.
the worst elements of the system,
mm-hmm.
the Soviet Union,
mm-hmm.
and ignored
mm-hmm.
the positive sides of that system, i.e., creating a literate society, providing electricity, modernizing the peasantry, encouraging small manufacturing at the local level. Before dreaming of building one of Africa's biggest dam on the Concouré, you cannot convince investors to invest in a country which has no infrastructure and ask them to pour in billions of dollars. Who will manage them?
Yeah.
Even at the accounting level, you don't have the people, the resources, the human resources.
So that's you were saying?
That's what differentiates it, that this comparison is valid to a point. The mimicry that the Guinean leadership did toward the Soviet Union was really picking and choosing the worst aspect and leaving the best aspect.
Okay, so this is the environment essentially that you found yourself in the late, I guess, towards the late 70s and early 80s before you won the scholarship and moved to America. Now, it's interesting, you've mentioned all of these limitations that were inherent in Guinea at that time, right? So we talked about illiteracy, we talked about poverty, lack of infrastructure and productive capacity. But it also seems essentially it becomes a microcosm of what other West African or African countries, sub-Saharan mainly, were suffering at the time, specifically after post-colonization, or some people might still say colonization, neo-colonization still continued. But this notion of all these things that were failing within the states, the African nations. And that brings us essentially to one of the main reasons why we wanted to do this podcast was for you to impart to a younger generation, specifically my generation, the millennials, a little bit of history, not just about modern Africa, but also pre-colonial Africa. That's why we titled this specific series, A Continent Between the Hammer and the Anvil. Why did you want to expound more about this paradigm of Africa within this context? Why Africa lags?
Well, it's the comparison factor again. When people compare Africa to Europe or to Asia, we need to keep in mind that Africa has been under a hammer and an anvil for almost 1,000 years, in if not 500 years. The first slave was sold in the Lagos area in the year 1415, I think. Slavery and prostitution are two activities that are as old as humanity. But they took slavery took a specific and heavy toll on Africa from two directions.
Which
the first one was the Islamic Oriental slavery.
So that's the east side of Africa, or
the east side from Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, you name it.
Ottoman Empire.
And then there is a history book written by a Burkina Faso politician by the name whose name is Nazi Boni, and he claimed that slavery from the Orient and Islamic raiders and conquerors cost Africa 20 million lives.
Wow!
Already. Okay, it may not be that high, but it's above the million, that's for sure. Then came the transatlantic slave trade, which really sealed somehow the fate of Africa because it plundered the continent from its main resources, the people. Now, came after when the Civil War ended in the United States. In Europe, the process of the Industrial Revolution was somewhat cementing itself, and Europe had the wherewithal, the means to really carry out a more aggressive policy of domination and exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it did in carving out Africa and its rush to the continent, the so-called scramble for Africa in 1884. The situation of Africa as the receiving end, as the visited, not the visitor, the conquered, not the conqueror, has to do with the fact that Europe itself had to go through several revolutions, internal revolutions, and very destructive ones that are first the political revolution, the French Revolution in 1789 with the Bastille destruction, and the beheading of the king and his queen. The ascendant bourgeoisie in France just didn't want any more to talk about or submit to the monarchy. So that's how the Industrial Revolution, the cultural, the political or ideological revolution that the French Revolution is, took place. And it was mirrored in Great Britain. A few years later, Britain also got rid of the monarchy and turned it into a symbolic instrument.
Can you expound on that a little bit? What time period are we talking about?
The Queen is still reigning in Great Britain, but it's a nominal power. It's token power.
They don't decree laws or anything like that.
The parliaments, right? The parliament and the prime minister hold the power, and these are the elements that came out of the bourgeoisie. So this is the English bourgeoisie, not the aristocracy.
So this is a constitutional monarchy we're talking about.
Right. The aristocracy has been put to the background, into the background, and the bourgeoisie has moved to the foreground, which was the reverse before.
Could you explain a little bit more in terms, because the terms might be anachronistic in this time period, but you're talking about aristocracy and bourgeoisie. What are the kind of parallels to modern day? Are we talking middle class? Are we talking... what is the foundation of what you call bourgeoisie and then the aristocrats?
The aristocracy was inherited power. If you are born into a monarch or a lord's family, then you are born into power and wealth. The bourgeoisie was a meritocratic kind of environment or class. You build yourself up from the bottom through your sense of business or your knowledge. You deserve what you earn, and that's what the bourgeoisie, who were the regular Joes, the regular people under the aristocracy or the monarchies of Europe. There were the peasants, there were the skilled workers who gradually amassed power and wealth and knowledge. And challenged the aristocracy. Told them, you are just contributing nothing to society except you
stealing.
You steal, and you contribute nothing in return. We are sweating our brain out to create wealth, to build the economy, and we deserve a share of the power. And actually, we will push you out of the power, or we make you recede to the background.